alumni and a Mauritanian born who grew up in Senegal, I am pleased to introduce Mamadou Diouf. Mamadou Diouf is Professor Mamadou Diouf, I should say. He is one of those African intellectuals who spend all their lives researching, studying, and trying to do their best for Africa to have a better place in this world. Professor Diouf is a Western African history at Columbia University professor. He serves also as the director of the Institute of African Studies at SIPA here, the School of International and Public Affairs. And he has been instrumental in its recent reorganization. Diouf holds a PhD in history from the University of Paris, Sorbonne. Prior to teaching at Columbia, he taught at the University of Michigan, and before that at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal. Diouf also serves on the editorial board of several academic journals, including such as Journal of African History and Public Culture. His research interests include the urban, political, social, and intellectual history of colonial and post-colonial Africa. His most recent books are La Construction de l'État au Sénégal, and it was published in 2002, and Histoire du Sénégal, Le Modèle Islamo-Wolof, essai Périphérie, published in 2001. This is Professor Mamadou Diouf. Please welcome Professor Diouf.
Okay, this session will be devoted to Muslim and Buddhist culture, and we will have 2 hours for presentation and discussions. We have 4 presenters, 2 on the United States and 2 on France. Unfortunately, Rosemary Hicks will not be here to present. Her paper will be presented by Ria Rahman from the Anthropology Department of the school. So I'm going to just follow the order of the list I had. The first presentation will be by Amel Boubacar. She is a research fellow at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in France and at the École Normale Supérieure. She is also an associate scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Her paper is on French Muslim and the invention of political Islam. So we have 20 minutes. And I have to do for policing that.
Okay, I will try to respect the time. Thanks for your invitation and thanks for your introduction. Actually, I would like to focus on the issue of integration as it is treated and considered in the French public sphere. And when we talk about integration actually in France, you often talk about the failure of integration of French Muslims. And what stands behind this failure of integration is much more the fear of radicalization of French Muslims. So that's an important paradigm that I would like you to memorize for the rest of my presentation. This interlink between the fear of failed integration, and the consecutive radicalization of it. Why that? Because actually when French Muslims have a discontentment about what France is offering to them in terms of integration policies, it is rarely seen as a process of political accountability of citizens toward their government. It is much more often seen as a ground for political conflict and radicalization, religious radicalization. So oftenly, when Muslims in France are not happy with what French integration policies are, the huge level of radicalization and political conflict is applied on these demands. For 30 years in France, in policy discourses, and when I'm talking about policy discourses, I'm talking about discourses and statements of policymakers, but also of media in public sphere, the challenge of integration has been mainly underlined not when it comes to social integration, non-social exclusion, but rather in times of crisis, in times of controversies, where Islam is seen as the main framework. What are these crises, for example? Well, the old Salman Rushdie affair, the more recent riots in France, the controversies around the veil, and the most recent one around the full vest called as the niqab in France, all the controversy around the cartoons of the Prophet, etc. All these events are key moments to discuss the challenge of integration of Muslims in France. The result of that is that finally linking these controversies and this social crisis in which Islam is involved in a way or another has gradually replaced the fear of social exclusion by the fear of radicalization if integration of French Muslims fails. So there are mainly three assumptions that stand behind the failed integration of Muslims in France. First, political demands, when they emanate from Muslims for political demands for greater integration, are inevitably linked to radicalization. That's the first assumption. The second one is that these political demands are made under foreign influence. They are made under an influence of foreign Islam, of the culture of foreign Islamic countries, and so on, and not made as, or not emanating from French Muslims' culture. Third assumption is that these political demands in which Islam play a role for greater integration, or the challenge of the current French model of integration, are not motivated by the fact that Muslims are identifying themselves as Muslims, mainly culturally speaking. The explanation is that they are identifying themselves as Muslims, mainly religiously speaking. So religious features are often considered as the main motivation for, or type of religiosities are mainly considered as the main reason for rejecting the French model of integration. And this paradigm has allowed French policymakers actually not to focus on, as I said previously, the issues of social integration and so on, but much more on the willingness to build a good, peaceful Islam that will be able to answer the danger of radicalization emanating from failed integration, and promoting intercultural policies and intercultural dialogue, which means that in order, okay, there's discussed that French model of integration has failed when it comes to Muslims, so let's try to promote a kind of intercultural dialogue between Muslims, because this is certainly their specificities as Muslims that is at the base of their failed integration. So those are assumptions from policymakers in France. My main argument in this paper, on the contrary, is that this is not actually the foreign influences of foreign Islam or the rejection of the French model of integration because of a kind of natural hate of the French society that is at the base of political demands from Muslims for greater integration. But on the contrary, what is at the base of these demands is the internalization of French values by Muslims, such as equality, such as freedom of speech, laicity, even though, and etc. And this is the internalization of these values that led Muslims to merge Islam or to use Islam when they have demands for greater integration. That's my main argument. So I would like to offer a real and concrete assessment of these assumptions in my paper, and to see currently what is the importance of on the ground of foreign influences in the failure of integration. That will be my first part. My second part will be on the European, on the contrary, the European roots of the controversial demands for a greater integration or its rejection. And finally, I would like to see and to assess what the importance of religion and religious values as such in demands for integration. So first, the importance of foreign influences in failed integration among French Muslims. Despite the fact that now Islam is purely a European religion, you have around 20 million of Muslims actually currently in Europe, Islam is still seen as a de facto foreign religion. And it led a lot of policymakers to consider that all demands from Muslims are are under foreign influences, and they are driven by other Islamic countries. And it's true that foreign influences have an important role to play in these political debates on integration and so, but it needs to be explained better how and through which channel. So first you have the channel of consular Islam in terms of external influence on the integration of French Muslims. This has been quickly mentioned this morning, but it's mainly the way foreign countries such as Algeria, such as Morocco, such as Turkey and Saudi Arabia are trying to take care or to take charge of the cult of Muslims when it comes to the organization or when it comes to the financing of mosques, for example, or religious institutions. But we have to underline that this was highly promoted by the French government itself, because it allows early immigrants, to rely on these foreign governments in their political demands for recognition, and not to address these demands to the French government. So for a long time, foreign Islam has been favored by the French government in order to manage the religious field. I mean, one concrete example of that is the role of the CFCM, le Conseil français du culte musulman, the French Council of Muslim Worship in France, that has been created by the then Ministry of Interior, Sarkozy, in 2003. And that's a process of elections, of local elections and so on. And it was so clear and so obvious how, for example, Morocco and Algeria were trying to put pressure on their nationals in order to favor lists that are related to Morocco and Algeria, when we are talking about the organization of French Islam. So, cultural Islam is important. The French government also has implemented this kind of foreign influences on French Islam through two concrete examples. First, when they wanted to, in France, when they wanted to expel radical imams, they do not enter into a process of negotiation or consultation with these imams, but they just expel them because they were considered as a radical treat. They just expel them to their country of origin. So the idea behind that was that radical Islam is obviously linked to a foreign influence and the presence of foreign imams on the French soil. A more concrete example, in 2004, the Ministry of Interior, the then Ministry of Interior, Nicolas Sarkozy, went to Egypt to ask, at that time, the Mufti of Al-Azhar, Tantawi, to issue a fatwa obliging young French girls to put on their veil. So it was an effort to promote a foreign Islamic discourse in order to influence or to design the kind of integration that French Muslims should adopt. You have also, in terms of foreign influences, the conception of foreign Islamic discourses. And the reason behind that is mainly because of the lack of indigenous French discourses, production of cultural, intellectual, and theological Islamic structure. So a lot of French Muslims are relying on the discourses of foreign scholars such as Al-Qaradawi, for example, and it can have a concrete impact in the reject of the French model of integration, for example, I'm thinking about a specific fatwa that this scholar, this Egypto-Qatari scholar, issued on the need to boycott products that are seen as Zionist or American. It was in the middle of the war in Iraq to also precise the context. And indeed, I mean, French Muslims, they could not rely on internal and indigenous French discourses, decided, not all of them, but a huge majority, especially among young Muslims, to rely on these foreign-produced Islamic discourses. Now I would like to assess what are the European roots of these controversial demands for integration or the rejection of the French model of integration. First, it's true that the backing of these demands may be foreign, but the motivation is purely European. I mean, that's my main argument in this paper. Why that? Even if I take very extreme examples, such as young French Muslims that have committed suicide attacks, and I had the sad chance to interview some of them before they commit suicide, of course, before they commit suicide attacks in Iraq 6 months later, and it was so clear that their the fact that they were attracted by jihadi kind of rejection of the French model of integration was mainly motivated by their own experience as French Muslims, and not motivated by the foreign influences of discourses from foreign Islamic scholars or whatever, because first they don't speak and they don't understand Arabic for the majority of them, and it was mainly related to their personal experience. Even when you have Salafism in the sense of, which is a movement, growing and rising movement for 15 years now in France and in Europe at large, and also here in the US. And these young Salafi, for example, reject also very much the French model of integration, and so, some of them decide to make what they call their hijra. The hijra is an Arabic name which means the immigration, but which refers to the immigration that the Prophet made from Mecca, where he was persecuted, to Medina, where he was able to spread Islam as a religion. So it's a strong, important narrative in the mind of these young French Muslims, and they decide themselves to make their hijra and to quit France as a sign of the rejection of the French model of integration, and to go to mainly Gulf countries. But how can we understand this move and the decision to quit France? Is it because they religiously hate the French model of integration? Not at all. It is mainly because in the Gulf they are able to reach a certain social bourgeois model of integration that, in their opinion, France has failed to offer to them. So I'm giving these examples to show how, even if the backing may be related to foreign influences, the motivation for the rejection of the French model of integration is purely French-based. The acceptation or the rejection of the French model of integration. And also challenge actually the usual links that are made between the rejection of the French model of integration, the recourse to violence, and the experience of radicalization. Let me try to offer a typology of 4 categories. First, you have what I can call secular Muslims, and 4 categories in the way Muslims at large are rejecting the French model of integration. First, you have the one that can be called secular Muslims. That's the pure case, and that's a perfect example of the riots that happened in France in 2005, for example. These guys were not observing Muslims. They were not frequenting mosques. They were not interested in theological debates, but they were identified as Muslims, and to some extent they also used this identity as Muslims as the identity of the weak and so on. But here, it challenged very much the assumption that religion was at the base of these riots. Why? Again, through a concrete example, some Muslim leaders have been asked to calm down these riots, and the famous Qaradawi, the scholar I was mentioning previously, even issued a fatwa saying that, you know, in Islam it's bad to commit civil violence and so on. These moves have had no effect on the young rioters. And it was the exact sign that religious arguments were not influencing or were not at the base of these riots, despite some included US commentaries that Paris was now Baghdad and that young Muslims were committing intifadas in the suburbs. So secular Muslims may be radicalized and may reject the French model of integration, but it is much more related to their personal experience of deprivation, of social exclusion, than their the fact that they belong to a specific religion. Second category, I would like to mention what can be, the kind of person that can be called observing Muslims activists, and to really sum up the kind of people I'm talking about. That's the Tariq Ramadan trend. I know that it's very famous here too. And I mean, these are those people that think that Islam should be the base for greater political involvement, for a good, active, proactive citizenship, and they don't consider that being a good citizen should mean, especially in France, to get away from one's religious identity. And here also, I mean, so they vote, in times of crisis, and even when they are contesting and challenging and trying to, not contesting, but when they are opposing the French model of integration, they do it through specific French tools, if I can put, and secular tools. They vote, they join political parties, they organize demonstrations, petitions, and so on. So here also, it is challenging that political involvement based on an Islamic religiosity is leading to a reduction of the French model of integration. Third category, and I would like to mention again the case of young Salafis, so in the sense of Wahhabi-inspired Salafi. They are born in France, for the majority of them. You have a lot of converts, but actually they simply reject the French model of integration. They just think that as France is not an Islamic model of political model, doesn't have Islamic structures, as Muslims they should reject the French model of integration. But here also, they indeed reject the model of French model of integration. They do not socialize with non-Muslim people. Of course, they work, they consume different kind of products and so on, but they try to limit at the maximum their interaction with non-Muslim and even with non-Salafi. But here also, even if they reject the French model of integration, they are absolutely not violent, they reject violence, and they even reject political involvement. So here also, it is challenging the assumption that religious radicalization is leading to political radicalization, because politics to them is not relevant and they don't want to be, and for example, they don't take part to demonstrations when it comes to defending the veil. I mean, they just don't care, and they just rather prefer to withdraw themselves from the public sphere. Final category, and I'm going to conclude if I have, again, okay, 1 minute. So the last category is about real cases of radicalization on a religious space, but not really, actually. I reserve the not really in order not to be just on a formal explanation. Let's take the example of jihadi actions. Okay, young French Muslims that have been involved in jihadi action. Again, from the experience, my interviews on the ground, and from the analysis of several cases, it is much more their personal experience of social exclusion, of failed integration, that is motivating their involvement in jihadi narratives. In other words, they radicalize themselves because they feel all this, they consider that their integration has failed, and then they look for a radical group and not the other way out. In conclusion, so here also, I mean, it's showing that the rejection of the French model of integration has sometimes little, or in that case, specific case, little to do with religious arguments. So in conclusion, I would say that Muslim views on what integration should be, Muslim views on the French model of integration should not be over-determinated by the religious variable. As I tried to mention it, there are complex interactions between national and international political environments that should be taken in account. At least and at the best, we may try to understand how different rules are given to Islam in legitimizing the French model of integration or rejecting it, as I try to do it with my 4 categories. But in any case, those are not monolithic choices. Actually, there's currently a process of common negotiation on what the French model of integration should be, much more than a fixed religious perception or rejection of what the French model of integration should be. And the real question now, it appears to me that the real question now is really, can French Muslims be drawn in political consultations on the role of Islam in process of integration without being considered as a security threat or as a destabilizing element to the French identity? Understanding more systematically the French roots of funding integration can open new perspective on the role of religion and integration. And it will be more fruitful to always rely on foreign cultural or religious specificities explanation. Really, the responses by the French government and French institutions to controversial Muslim demands for integration should not be anymore a matter of intercultural dialogue, this was the case, for example, during the cartoon episode, or an obsessional concern for potential radicalization. But the challenge of integration of Muslims in France now is really to ensure equality above the variety of understanding of what French models of integration should be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed. The next presentation is a paper by Rosemary Hicks. She's a Mellon Interdisciplinary Graduate Fellow at the Institute for Social and Economic Research and Policy here at Columbia University. The paper will be presented by Ria Rahman from the Anthropology Department, New School. The title, An Abrahamic America, Lay Muslim Intellectual, American Exceptionalism, and Public Critique.
Thank you. Rosemary asked if she prepared beginning comments before I actually present the paper. I'd like to thank the organizers, especially Professor King, for inviting me to participate in this conference, and to offer my sincerest apologies for not being able to deliver this paper in person. I am in California due to a family emergency and had hoped to return in time for the conference, but am not able to. Thus, I would like to thank my fellow presenters and Professor Diop for their patience and understanding, as well as Ria Rahman of the Anthropology Department at the New School for delivering this paper in my stead. This presentation is drawn from my dissertation research, and the name of the paper has been slightly changed. Instead of Lay Muslim Intellectuals, American Exceptionalism, and Public Critique, should change it to Belonging and Critique, which will make sense when we get the paper. In 1979, first-generation Egyptian Muslim immigrant Muhammad Abdul Rauf, the Imam of the Islamic Center in Washington, D.C., discussed Judeo-Christian Muslim commonality with scholars of a variety of different traditions and academic methods. His colleague, Temple University professor Ismail al-Faruqi, a Palestinian refugee, had helped to organize their Abrahamic Trialogue for that year's annual meeting of the American Academic Academy of Religion in New York. Faruqi likewise challenged Judeo-Christian exclusivity with what he saw as more ethical and Arab-inclusive narratives. Throughout his presentation, Muhammad Abdul Rauf primarily outlined what united the three traditions. In his opening remarks, however, he addressed what had brought that particular AAR panel into being. Further, he underlined the role of American foreign policy and Judeo-Christian exclusivity in producing wide-scale Muslim distress. As he told his New York audience, quote, "We meet today in a climate of tension caused by recent events in Iran. We do not by any means advocate or even condone the practice of taking hostages as a measure of attaining legitimate aspirations. But the recent events in Iran have aroused in us, as well as in any serious and honest humans, deep reflections, nay, anxieties over past events of recent history. For decades, the Muslims of Iran were tyrannized over by an inhumane dictatorship which slaughtered, tortured, and maimed them with the full blessing and collaboration of the West. Palestinians were driven from their own home en masse by Zionists. Tens and tens of thousands of humans have been killed, tortured, or maimed, while the Christian West furnished all the political and economic support and supplied the arms and munitions needed by the perpetrators of genocide. Southern Lebanon's innocent citizens have been bombarded by the most destructive weapons, napalm and cluster bombs, generously given by a nation committed to the so-called Judeo-Christian moral tradition." End quote. In this and other speeches, Mohammed Abdul Rauf carefully navigated the waters of claiming belonging and at the same time offering critique. Less than 2 years later, at a conference specifically about Islam in North America, Abdul Rauf and Farouqi based their different models of Abrahamic progress and inclusion on the next generation of American Muslims. That more settled second generation would be fully American and would thus have the ability, they maintain, to create more equitable domestic and international unity. As Abdul Rauf argued, quote, "The rising generations are seeking to equip themselves with better education, diversifying their interest in order to assert their rights and defend the honor of their heritage in the American environment. In this way, they will contribute more greatly to the glory of the country of their choice, and also will be able to build better bridges of understanding and cooperation between the United States and the Islamic fatherland, creating relationships of justice and equality." End quote. After 2001, as I discussed in this paper, 2 second-generation Muslim American intellectuals likewise attempted to foster more ethical and inclusive Abrahamic Americanness. Their more recent models of second-generation culture and commonality relied on both these first-generation Arab intellectuals' efforts to navigate the waters of belonging and critique, as well as on older Jewish intellectuals' sociologies of religious development. These sociologies, most significantly, Will Herbert's model of American Judeo-Christian commonality, are ones that highlight the second-generation struggles to navigate between custom and authentic religious practice, as well as between the new opportunities and vices of settled and more acculturated existence. Importantly, as I demonstrate here, American Judeo-Christian and Abrahamic models are all premised on the same sociological and historical patterns. These patterns and their stories about second-generation accommodation and resistance, belonging, and critique are, in turn, indebted both to Muslim philosopher Ibn Khaldun's 14th century arguments and to post-9/11 narratives of American exceptionalism. But first, let us return to the first generation. Both Ismail al-Farouqi and Mohammed Abdul Rauf had trained at Al-Azhar and in humanities doctoral programs in the United States and Britain, Harvard and SOAS, respectively. Further, both intentionally framed Muslim inclusion in terms of American Jewish precedent. They did so while critiquing American support of Israeli actions and American neo-imperialism elsewhere. By expanding not just Americanness, but the kind of atrocities Americans were obligated to prevent, they navigated the waters of American belonging and critique in different ways. Further, they established the intellectual frameworks and institutional networks through which the next generation, most specifically here, lay Muslim intellectuals Faisal Abdul Rauf, Mohammed Abdul Rauf's son, and Faiz Khan, asserted Abrahamic commonality. In their 21st century models, both Rauf, a Columbia University trained physicist, and Khan, an emergency room doctor and at one time Rauf's assistant imam, used sociological paradigms that Jewish intellectuals Emil Durkheim and Will Herbert deployed to analyze religious and cultural solidarity. Crucially, in creating Abrahamic narratives, Rauf and other Muslim Americans like Herbert also criticized American melting pot models of assimilation and the laxity of some second-generation religious practices. The lay practices were ones that reflected customs, overly immigrant on the one hand and overly American on the other, more than they reflected authentic religious engagement. These narratives of second-generation religious and cultural change were shaped through the particular circumstances of 20th century political and economic developments and massive demographic shifts. Nevertheless, those who articulated them all with varying degrees of awareness, use the same 14th century narrative template, Ibn Khaldun's universal history. Ibn Khaldun had charted the change from tribal nomadic culture to refined and somewhat decadent civilization along a developmental trajectory of 4 generations. Each generation for Ibn Khaldun was compromised for 40 years. Those 40 years in turn represented the 10-year career of Prophet Muhammad plus the 30-year career of the Caliphate following him. In the Muqaddimah, Ibn Khaldun's comprehensive introduction to his universal history, or Kitab al-Ibad, he cited the Prophet's prediction that the Caliphate after me will last 30 years, Then it will revert to being tyrannical royal authority. Following the first Caliphate, Ibn Khaldun described subsequent political dynasties, Islamic and otherwise, rose and fell along a cycle of 40-year changes from first generation tribal custom to second generation settled city dwellers to third generation literate urban culture and the anti-religious trappings of luxury and the good life. The fourth generation was that of tyranny and decline. Ibn Khaldun's generational models and theories of developmental change were translated into colonial policy and social theory in the 19th and 20th centuries, and later became central to histories of religion and immigration and American sociology. Thus, it is not surprising that after 9/11, as I discussed further below, Faisal Abdul-Rauf premised Abrahamic Americanness and Muslim identity on previous models of Christian and Jewish generational change. Significantly, though, Rauf's and Kahn's models did not involve decline. As Rauf argued in 2003, quote, "When Christians first came to America, within a couple of generations, the religion assumed a different character. Even in the Old World, you had differences between German Lutherans and Swedish Lutherans, so much so that when they came here, they wouldn't even speak to each other. The same thing with Judaism, but after a generation or two, a culturally American Judaism emerged, and more than just cultural. I mean, look at what's happened to Judaism in America. So it is my conviction that the same thing is bound to happen to the Islamic experience. We can, by looking at the history of our Christian and Jewish predecessors, foretell some broad outlines." End quote. Ibn Khaldun's 14th century typology, on which Rauf's narrative was based, ostensibly lay in obscurity until the European colonial era. French Orientalists rediscovered his comprehensive introduction in a 1697 Bibliothèque Orientale, a dictionary of titles Barthélemy de Herbelot had acquired in Italy. In 1806, the first French translations were published and the first German ones in 1812. Importantly, Ibn Khaldun's theories circulated in Italy centuries prior. Thus, as I discuss in my dissertation, his models may have influenced world history narratives in the making of modernity in ways yet to be fully recognized. More centrally here, Ibn Khaldun's work was translated in the early 19th century into genres of French, German, and British racial cultural theory, transformed into colonial policy in Algeria, and also turned into sociology and anthropology, new colonial disciplines in British and French universities. Emile Durkheim came to know Ibn Khaldun's concept of asabiyya, which might loosely be translated as group solidarity, from his Egyptian doctoral student Taha Hussein. Later, British Orientalists and historians such as Arnold Toynbee also incorporated Ibn Khaldun's work into their narratives about religion. In Toynbee's often quoted works, Ibn Khaldun's History of Philosophy, quote, "is undoubtedly the greatest work of its kind that has ever yet been created by any mind in any time or place," end quote. Will Herberg, who relied on Toynbee in his 1955 History of Judeo-Christian America, agreed. Historians of American religion have signaled the post-World War II period as a time of enshrining Judeo-Christian narratives in American culture, legislation, and politics, and of allowing Jews greater, though limited, access in these arenas. Though originally formulated by 19th century German scholars, narratives of Judeo-Christian civilization and culture increasingly marked both legislation and idealized narratives of American pluralism after World War II. Will Herberg's 1955 Protestant Catholic Jew, an essay in American religious sociology, contributed to this trend, even though Herberg criticized the somewhat luxurious decadence of second and third generation immigrants and the general culture of American religion. In using the term Abrahamic, and somewhat like Herberg, Muslim intellectuals celebrated and contested the limits of Judeo-Christian frameworks. Just as Muhammad Abdul-Rauf, for example, criticized American foreign policy in his 1979 AAR address, Faisal Abdul-Rauf likewise challenged the U.S. to fulfill its multicultural and pluralist promises, and argues that Abrahamic pluralism includes all faiths. Also, like Herberg, their narratives highlight the importance of the second generation in sifting religion from custom. As Faiz Khan, who immigrated with his family from India as an infant, argued, the most important thing Muslim and non-Muslim Americans could do after 9/11 is, quote, "get acquainted with what is authentically Islamic and what is not. That means what in our way of life, our customs, our dress, our gender-related relations, are consistent with what the Prophet said and did, and what in our way of life is not. I challenge a conservative immigrant imam to relate to someone from Tribeca, where my mosque is," end quote. Crucially, Rauf and his colleague Faiz Khan's second-generation models, ones they promote and claim to embody, are shaped by late 20th century narratives of multiculturalism, not melting pot assimilation. While these multicultural narratives can allow for greater flexibility and different ways of articulating belonging and critique, they can also further exacerbate tensions between different groups of Muslims in the United States. Khan gave voice to both of these dynamics when he acknowledged the upwardly mobile trends of particular immigrants and the different experiences and different struggles of African American Muslims. Quote, growing up in Long Island, an upper middle class suburb, I was definitely different from other Muslim youths from families not so well off. My parents were both doctors and led very busy professional lives. The Muslim scene in America is very diverse. What you have is an immigrant class that made good. There's a whole subculture of them, Indians, Pakistanis, and Arabs too. African Americans make up a large part of the American Muslim world where the scene changes. They come from different socioeconomic stratum, end quote. For Khan, his parents' religion was one of sentiment and custom rather than examined practice. Their sentiments were good, but when it came to crossing socio-ethnic lines and building an embracing community, a component of true Islam which recognized no difference between one human being and another based on color or outward attributes, the embrace was less than robust, end quote. According to Khan, however, second-generation American Muslims had different experiences and more open outlooks. Look, he argued, it's fine to be more comfortable with one's given cultural matrices, but at the same time, there is most definitely a deep-seated racist and classist element that exists among Indian and Pakistani immigrants to our cultures, particularly African Americans. But that a priori doesn't exist in my generation because we grew up here, so we're comfortable with everybody, end quote. In contrast to the second generation's perspective, the group solidarity and defensiveness of earlier generations was, quote, more of a xenophobia on the part of immigrants, end quote. While the cultural ineptitude and racism of his parents' generation was wicked, Khan admitted, quote, at the same time, the African American community needs to understand that a lot of this is just cultural, end quote. In other words, as Khan went on to explain, cultural practices were optional. They were the ones that did not have to necessarily hinder group or individual progress in America. Quote, if I'm not attracted to a particular culture, he explained, I'm not going to necessarily appreciate or embrace it. While aware of socioeconomic differences, Khan did not discuss the possibility of that his view of generational change and progress was influenced by his socioeconomic status. Further, he described American progress and intra-Muslim differences as cultural matters. Brought up as a self-described second-generation Indian Muslim who never felt outside the American mainstream, Khan did not seem to question the exceptionality of his American experience. In describing the past and future of American Islam, he knit together models of Judeo-Christian change premised on Ibn Khaldun's secularized theories with American narratives of progress and late 20th century multicultural harmony. Further, like his colleague Faisal Abdul-Rauf, he described 21st century Abrahamic Americanness as emblematic of his progressive rise without decline. In his 2004 work on Abrahamic Americanness titled What's Right with Islam is What's Right with America, Rauf specifically cited Herberg as proof of American pluralist promise. While Herberg did not directly cite Durkheim in his functional sociology of generational change, religious assimilation, and American critique, he did rely on Toynbee's history. Further, he echoed Toynbee's argument that a society's survival depended on its ability to respond to moral and religious changes, something that Toynbee derived partially from Ibn Khaldun. Herberg, who was primarily a Marxist secular intellectual, argued in that Toynbee was too mystical in his history, and that Toynbee viewed religion as a primary cause of social problems, social change, and politics and economics as secondary. However, he also agreed with Toynbee on the declining piety of upwardly mobile middle-class generations and with what he called the Toynbee law of idolization, in which humans mistook their ephemeral, customary practices for authentic, eternal religion. For Herberg, more like Ibn Khaldun than Toynbee, the minute specifics of historical circumstances are crucial, and generalizations are difficult to make. However, the generational socioeconomic model of economically inflected transition from vital, local customs, tribal traditions, to refined and possibly decadent culture is specific to both. As for how Rauf and Khan engage Herberg's inter-religious model of American religion and generational change when accounting for Islam, An important thing to keep in mind is that their common ancestor, Ibn Khaldun, did not have a linear progress model of development. Rise and decline was cyclical for Ibn Khaldun, but not reformative, or, one might argue, not Protestant or Protestant secular. Thus, Ibn Khaldun's analysis of the transition from custom to refined culture was not one that promised ultimate perfectibility. As early Orientalists, translators, and commentators observed, Ibn Khaldun hardly even presents a messianic model of time, and his work lacks the overt emphasis on ultimate redemption of other Muslim philosophers who followed and preceded him. For the two intellectuals I discuss here, though, who are separated from Ibn Khaldun by more than half a millennia, and are both first-generation and second-generation Muslim Americans in different ways, redemption, reform, and progress are necessary elements in generational narratives. Further, they are the very basis of including Islam in, as well as the basis for what Islam contributes to America. Islam is the reforming force for both, and is simultaneously traditional and a progressive protest against the decadent lack of social concern and exclusion of a culturally sophisticated state. Their use of ideas about culture and custom echo both their American Muslim predecessors' arguments against imperialism and Herbert's arguments about generational exclusions and excess. However, both Rauf and Kahn often abstract these arguments about custom, culture, and progress from the economic aspects central in different ways to their various predecessors' analyses. Instead, both naturalize upward mobility as part of individual and social progress and speak more about the weight of culture and custom in detracting from authentic religious practice than they do about politics and economics. Their turn to culture and custom as explanatory models for the United States, more than or to the exclusion of socioeconomic factors, reflects American liberal discourses of multiculturalism and, to some extent, what Mahmoud Mamdani describes as culture talk, which tends to hide the political and economic factors through which identities become meaningful in different ways. In concluding this brief overview of second-generation arguments and arguments about second generations, I must emphasize that I have not traced these models to Ibn Khaldun so as to prove that American notions of culture, Judeo-Christian commonality, and generational change are actually Islamic or Abrahamic after all, nor have I done so to make the opposite case. Rather, I focus on how contemporary arguments about culture and second generations both replicate and critique Protestant and secularized interpretations of Ibn Khaldun's theories, as well as replicate and critique the exclusions produced by colonial and contemporary uses of them. In examining the lives and afterlives of Ibn Khaldun's work and its ramifications for Muslims in America, I hope to foster further questions about histories, futures, and identity in the 24th century, and about the tensions and narrative templates of belonging and critique. Thank you.
Thank you very much for accepting to be here. The next presenter is Natalie Kaplan. She is a research fellow and lecturer at Brotherhood in Milan, in Italy. The title of her presentation is Search of Intellectual Requalification in Islam, the Arab Youth in France.
First of all, thank you very much. The so-called affaire du foulard, in other words, the issue of the headscarf, quickly escalated from a local classroom problem to a national controversy. And from 1989 until now, the most common representation has argued that the young Muslim women had to wear the headscarf because they obey their parents. So wearing the headscarf has been viewed as the result of the family pressure. And this representation is not new in France, as a famous book chapter from Frantz Fanon showed. And this book chapter is called Unveiled Woman, and is about women and the French state during the French colonization. So this representation of headscarf as a result of the family pressure is definitely not new. Representation of young Muslim men are quite different. Political events in Algeria in the 90s and the 9/11 contributed to spread the idea that foreign radical movements strongly affect the male religious attitude. And to a certain extent, this dimension should not be overlooked, as academic literature has showed the growing impact of globalization on attitudes and identities. Indeed, we witness a substantial weakening of nation-states and the multiplication of citizens' loyalties due to financial, cultural, and migratory flow. However, my work in France shows that the religious attitudes of the young men and women are not primarily affected by globalization and international events, but rather they are embedded, definitely embedded, in transition to adulthood. What does the transition to adulthood mean? It means a transition from school to the labor market, and another transition from the family of origin to the creation of a new one. The shaping of young Muslim beliefs are embedded in this transition to adulthood, and more precisely in trajectories at school, in the labor market, and in local institutions. Transition to adulthood is traditionally a time of experimentation. But this transition is now becoming increasingly complex. In France, for instance, we find an increasing gap between, an increasing disconnect between the degree and position people access in the labor market. We also find in France a heavy problem of youth unemployment. There is also a greater competition between young people of different social backgrounds to access position in the labor market, at school as well. I will show that the second generation of North African background in France turns a part of the family heritage, Islam, into a symbolic and material resource to become an adult in a very complex context. There were different ways of becoming an adult, and therefore a great diversity of religious attitudes amongst the youth. The research findings I'm going to present stem from long field work conducted in a French middle-sized city near Lyon and not very far from Geneva. I will show that the Swiss Islamic field contributes to affect the religious attitudes of the French, of the young young Muslim French I investigated, because we witness transnational identities. My fieldwork consisted in in-depth interviews, participant observation, and analysis of local archives. First of all, Islam to contradict the school judgment. I would like to say a few words about the main ethnic group I'm going to talk about. The North African population mainly arrived in the 60s in France. They were mainly single men at this time. During the 70s and the 80s, the possibility of returning to one's country of origin diminished, and there has been a definitive settling of these immigrants with le regroupement familial, the family reunification. Most of the young people of North African origin grew up in Muslim families in which parents practiced the Ramadan and the Muslim tradition, but most of the parents did not pray five times a day or did not make the Mecca pilgrimage. Young people of North African definitely distance themselves from the parental religious heritage, and they reinterpret religion on their own way. Certain religious attitudes are shaped by young people's experience at school and the feeling of being intellectually devalued because of their ethnic minority origin. I have to remind that young people of North African in France have grown up keeping in mind this idea. we will become professional, we will become managers, whereas our parents were manual workers. And university will enable us to access to this position of managers, professional, and certainly not manual workers. When young people, and especially young men, don't achieve in the high or secondary school, some of them complain of being negatively labeled at school because they have North African origin. And they complain of being pushed towards low-skilled jobs instead of the professional vocation and lifestyles they would like to access. This is particularly remarkable at the end of the secondary school, when, after the so-called French brevet, certain pupils of North African origin are steered towards vocational schools, whereas other pupils have the possibility of going to a more academic institution. Some young men use religion as a tool to oppose academic decision. They attend different groups and theological, philosophical seminars to show to themselves, but also to other people, that they are also able to be intellectually proactive. Yes, we can as well. By becoming a student in theology, for instance, and attending religious seminars, young men are in search of intellectual requalification. And in the field I investigated, Tariq Ramadan is a key figure. Tariq Ramadan, you certainly have heard of Tariq Ramadan. This famous leader was born in Geneva, Switzerland, in the 60s. He organized many religious seminars in Switzerland, but also in France in the 90s. In the 90s, Tariq Ramadan was everywhere in France, not only in the French Paris disadvantaged neighborhood, but also in Marseille, in Lille, in Bordeaux, in Strasbourg. And also he was present in my field, because between Lyon and Geneva. This religious leader is also an intellectual. Tariq Ramadan has 2 PhD in philosophy and religious studies. No, he has a PhD, sorry. He has a PhD in philosophy and religious studies. And in his seminars, he likes quoting Rousseau, Voltaire, and famous thinkers. He is truly at ease when he speaks. And young men feel very valued when they hear, when they listen to Tariq Ramadan. It's striking to see how they want to establish a dialogue with him at the end of his seminars, because they feel that they are students in theology when they listen to Tariq Ramadan. It marks a huge contrast with their position at school, which does not enable young men to have access to the status of student at university when they go to vocational schools. Pupils in vocational school do not study philosophy. There is no philosophy for them. Whereas there is philosophy in French high schools. So when they are participating in religious seminars, they listen to Tariq Ramadan talking about philosophers, and they feel respected from an intellectual point of view. This search of intellectual requalification has also another dimension. Young people read books or listen to religious speeches which spread a prestigious conception of Islam. In this conception of Islam, this religion is viewed as a powerful religion, which strongly contributed to the progress of humanity, especially in the matter of science, philosophy, and political structure. Muslim scholars, as Averroes, are often quoted in these pages or in these books. These religious perspectives give the young people the feeling of being a descendant of a prestigious history, which marks a huge contrast with their current social situation at school or in the urban areas. The second kind of identification with Islam I noticed in my fieldwork, I analyzed in my fieldwork, is the fact of restoring the male domination through identification with Islam. This second kind of identification is strongly linked to the gender issue, and more especially to different school attainments according to the sex. Different studies show that young women are more successful at school than their male counterparts at all levels in the educational system. And data surveys show that, data surveys show that young women are more likely to adopt participatory behaviors, to remain concentrated in tasks, and to listen to the professor. Young women are more apt to adopt the behavior of modern students, whereas male students appear less likely to conform to school behaviors and codes. These gender differences in a matter of school performance do challenge the traditional roles within the Muslim families and contribute to shape different religious attitudes according to the sex. Many young women I investigated are successful at school, whereas their brother fail. Young women use Islam to show their loyalty to the family. And the case of Samira is especially interesting from this point of view. This young woman started practicing Islam when she became a university student. She had to move to another city at this time, and during 4 years studies, social control became much more important than before. For example, on Saturday morning, at the end of the week, her brothers, who were unemployed at this time, picked her up and brought her to the family home. And on Sunday evening, at the end of the weekend, they took her back to the city where she was studying. For Samira, practicing Islam at this time was a way of showing her family that she was faithful to the family heritage. It was striking to observe that when she completed her studies and came back to her city to teach in a high school, she immediately stopped practicing. In this case, young women reinterpret religion on their own way to be able to go ahead between family constraints and search for autonomy. I also noticed that some young women say to their parents that their Islam is spiritual. My Islam is in the heart. When their parents want them to practice religion, these young women answer that Islam is in the heart, so they continue the family heritage, but at the same time they distance themselves from the family heritage, and they oppose their parents' religious attitudes organized around dogmas and rules. Whereas some young women try to get more autonomy through reinterpretation of Islam, some young men try to restore the male domination. The female higher rate of school success makes some young men less comfortable with women because they struggle to find a partner. And they feel devalued with respect to the other sex. these young men identify with a conservative conception of Islam, according to which women have to stay at home and bring children. These young men go to conservative religious group in order to find modest feminine partners, accessible partners, who organize their life around an orthodox conception of Islam. So as you see, and continue what you said about Islam as a French-based problem, I definitely agree with this conception, because we see that school trajectories, different school attainment according to the sex, definitely impact on attitudes, and not what happens in Algeria or in Egypt or in foreign countries. My third point will be about the use of the Islamic reference in the local institution. My work also focused on how young people use Islam in the public sphere, in the public arena, and more especially in local institutions. Since the 80s, the youth living in the disadvantaged neighborhood are considered as a target population by local institutions. La politique de la ville, the politique de la ville, has meant a development of several policies aiming to offer many activities to young people outside school hours. For the politique de la ville, it means that we have to provide different activities to young people, and they will remain quiet. Since the 90s, social centers have started recruiting young men of North African background as youth workers. And many of these youth workers of North African background have been university graduates, but they did not find a qualified job. And they do feel ethnically discriminated against in the French society. So remember that they are graduates, they have a degree, they started to be successful in the French society, they went to university, so they are educated, but they do not find a qualified job. So when these young men apply for a job in social centers, they consider it as a second choice. So it's not the job they wanted to access. It's a second choice, and they consider it with a great bitterness. They believe that rather than being youth workers, they should be directors of social centers, because they went to university and they know well the area and its population. My investigation showed that some of these young workers of youth workers of North African background use Islam in their everyday work in social centers to oppose the middle managers and even the director of social centers. For instance, Abdel Wafi speaks about Islam to children who go to the social center to create a greater proximity with children, but also to pushing his white non-Muslim colleague aside. Abdel Wafi says to Arnaud, his boss, "You are not from the area. You are not from the area. You don't know the North African population because you are not Muslim." So we see that Abdel Wafi thinks that he should have Arnaud's position in the structure and uses the Islamic reference to support this idea that is more qualified than his colleague. In another case, some youth workers use Islam to appropriate the social centers and lay down the law in the social center. And I investigated the case of tense relationships between two young men, Malek, Rashid, and their head, Brigitte, during the time of the Ramadan. The head wanted to organize a lecture about Islam. And she said to Malek and Rashid, try to find a lecturer who will present the cultural dimension of Islam, music, dance, art. Rather than following Brigitte's recommendation, both youth workers invited Annie Ramadan to lecture in the social center. Secular social center, of course. Annie Ramadan is a well-known Swiss Muslim leader based in Geneva, and he has a very orthodox conception of Islam, and he never speaks about dance, culture, and art. In the interview, Brigitte told me the day of the conference, in the morning, police made a call to tell me, you are inviting Annie Ramadan. Do you know who he is? He is not allowed to come to France. And of course, she continued in the interview by saying, I started to be in a great panic. I did not know anything about Annie Ramadan, and I said to Malek, cancel the conference, I cannot take a risk. But Malek told me, I can't, calling you. And she called Annie Ramadan, sorry, I should not make a confusion because they are very different. She called Annie Ramadan, and she was insulted. He said, who are you to cancel the conference? Pick up me at the Muslim Center in Geneva, as it has been scheduled.
I think you should go.
Yes, I'm Indian.
No, I'm not saying you should conclude.
Yes, it's my conclusion now. Okay. So here, Malek and Rashid used the Islamic reference to contradict their head's recommendation, challenge authority, and appropriate the social center at the end. To conclude, we now observe a linear transmission of religion within Muslim families. Young people of North African origin distance themselves from the parental religious heritage, and they reinterpret religion on their own way. This phenomenon also concerns the Protestant, Jewish, and Catholic young people. Sociologists of religion have shown that since the 70s, beliefs are being detached from religious authorities or family heritage. And we are witnessing the production of small systems of meanings built according to the needs which emerge in individual biographies. And for example, in France, Daniel Hervé-Léger, who is a sociologist of religion, says that individuals adjust their beliefs to their own experience. Everyone takes charge for themselves of shaping the reference to the tradition in which they recognize themselves. The relationship with Islam of the young generation of North African background is a matter of religious bricolage embedded in this time of transition to adulthood. And they reinterpret religion in relation to the ups and downs of their experience. Therefore, understanding the shaping of young Muslim religious attitudes requires a deep analysis of their trajectories, and especially the transition to adulthood, which is decisive in individuals' relationship with society and in the way they define themselves within society. Trajectories are built in a system of social and economic constraints, of course. It means that to understand the Muslim beliefs in Europe, sociology of religion is not enough. we also may take into account sociology of family, sociology of school, urban sociology. And we have to consider the overlapping of different factors such as social class, the changing gender relationships, urban logic, and ethnicity, and show how these different mechanisms shape role in society and access to position at school and in the labor market.
I've been involved with the groups that I will be discussing, and lastly I worked with the Council on American Islamic Relations as research director. I developed their annual report on the status of Muslim civil rights, and I produced some of the literature on religious accommodation at the various institutional settings in the United States that gave legitimacy to looking at the Muslim experience and Muslim needs from this particular angle. But I left CARE in late 2007, and I'm now looking at the American Muslim experience from the outside in. I was looking at them from the inside out previously. So I'm having the advantage of both ways of looking at this experience. So what I bring with me is that first-hand knowledge of the community, and I'm a political scientist by training, but although I'm interdisciplinarian, always been. And but in political science, when we talk about political actors, whether people who are in the field or aspiring actors, we deal with them seriously. So much of the discussion thus far, with the exception of few, has been related to interpretation of Islam or cultural representation of Islam. My work is more about structural factors. Dr. Kuru talked about that from a legal philosophical perspective. I will talk about political actors in terms of real players in the field and their role. So my goal of investigating the practical politics of the Muslim Brotherhood, and my studies don't try to project the Muslim Brotherhood as this dominant group that speaks for all Muslims. Now I understand, I've documented the very diverse nature of the American Muslim experience at various levels of action and thought. So, but my goal of investigating the Muslim Brotherhood in the U.S. and its implications for U.S. engagement with the Muslim world derives from observing the roles of self-reliant Islamic groups have played in the American domestic scene, and from assuming that political Islam in the United States has not reached its potential. This research is based on three major sources: first-hand knowledge as scholar activist, the empirical data that I collected through by years at the Council on American Islamic Relations, and of course library research that helped me identify the sources and the different perspectives on the questions and concerns addressed in this paper. To understand how the Muslim Brotherhood could fit in the larger picture of American polity, this paper attempts to build on the work of Harvard professor Tony Smith on how citizens with foreign attachments have influenced not only domestic and foreign policy discussions, but also the very nature of the American political system. Several historical factors have exerted pressure on the very character of American democracy, as outlined earlier this morning by Dr. Asman Kane. And we just summarize them very quickly here. Many immigrants arrived in the post-colonial period with ethnic and religious awareness, including Muslims who had experienced Islamic revivalism, joined a society American society that has moved to acknowledge its own diversity. The civil rights movement in the 60s was followed by the rise of multiculturalism. American involvement in the world has grown tremendously as the US rose to a preeminent power position. With globalization and the end of the Cold War, Americans have become part of the outside world, and the world has become part of America. Given the openness of the American political process to a wide range of lobbying in foreign affairs, it would be surprising if Muslim activists have not affected policy debates in Washington. Indeed, September 11 has caused a sea change in Washington's attitude toward political Islam. For good or bad, the movement, with its extremist and moderate manifestations, is now seen as a player in global politics. How efficient is American government in interpreting and dealing with the demands of Islamic activists? That's something we can answer once we know who these people are and what they want and how they affect the public discourse in America. Tony Smith contrasts three major visions for the new American democracy: multiculturalist, nationalist, and pluralist. And I suppose this covers much of the manifestations that were presented in the earlier papers. Assimilationism has always been the preferred option in the nationalist discourse. Multiculturalists would define their goal in terms of a peaceful coexistence between all groups, including the new entrants. And obviously that should include the Muslim Brotherhood, who are now American citizens. Pluralists, that's where Tony Smith and I belong, share the value of diversity with multiculturalists, but share with nationalists a commitment to a generalized rather than particularized conception of American citizenship. Pluralists, however, concede that because of the factional nature of American civil society, there could be multiple definitions of what is in the best interest of the general public. I'm just cutting through the paper to be able to read the most important parts of it. Given the fact that much of the public debate about Islamic activism stems from policy concerns in places where America has few friends among radicalized populations, and the heightened public apprehension about the prospects of terrorism in the homeland, it is an opportune time to raise the question whether American Muslim activists, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in America, although still small, quantitatively speaking, but very influential, especially among Arab Americans who practice the faith. It is the largest segment of that community in terms of organizational expression. It is an opportune time to raise the question whether those Muslim activists can be counted on to stem the tide of radicalism in the Muslim world by first becoming incorporated into America's pluralistic democracy. The second objective of this paper is to address the ethical questions surrounding arguments specifying the rights and obligations of Islamic citizens in American democracy. Given that American Muslims with foreign attachments are only one of many factions presenting demands to the political system, questions arise about the justification of the attempts by the competing groups to define the American polity in general. Smith proposes rules for responsible citizenship that are used as a framework in this paper. Two rules that he presents are particularly relevant. One, no faction should work to further the agendas of foreign groups or governments, regardless of thinking in Washington or America at large. Two, factions must respond to fair criticism of their demands and their activities in ways that deal with the merits of the charges against them. Now, before I go into applying this framework of democratic pluralism and responsible citizenship to the Muslim Brotherhood, let me just touch on how this kind of compares to the French case, since we're comparing. I think if Tony Smith would examine all what has been said about France, he would point out two things, two important features that kind of explains why the French would be more on the nationalist, nativist side than Americans. Demographic change is a factor. America's demography has changed much more dramatically than the French demography, although there has been a rise in the number of Muslims in France. And of course, the issue here for America is not just Muslims, although the number of Muslims here is smaller than the number of Muslims in France, but Muslims are part of a much growing minority population in the US. The other, of course, important factor is the position of France in global affairs vis-a-vis the power position of the US, which makes the French more kind of insular in their looking and more nativist. Okay, so all right, and I'm kind of confused now. All right, and so now, what do the Muslim Brotherhood have to offer? So let's start with that. Robert Lycan and Stephen Brooke, fellows with the Nixon Center, hardly a beacon of multiculturalism, identify mutual interests between the U.S. and the Muslim Brotherhood, and here they're talking global. The Muslim Brotherhood is an organization that has 77 chapters across the globe. So they identify the mutual interests in terms of opposition to Al-Qaeda, the encouragement of democracy, and resistance to expanding Iranian influence. And of course, they propose dialogue with this group, and specifically starting with Muslim Brotherhood reformists, especially those who reside in the West. Hence, the focus on the Muslim Brotherhood in America. Okay, I go a bit into their history and how they emerged. Some of them came back in the 50s and later in later decades, fleeing persecution in their countries of origin, the Egyptians, and then later the 80s and the Syrians, the Iraqis. But most of them came as part of the post-1965 immigration wave. And while some of them came as well-trained professionals, doctors, engineers, a lot of them came as foreign students. And they kind of decided after graduation and getting good jobs or taking American spouses to stay and become American citizens. But no sooner Muslim Brotherhood members arrived to the U.S. in the early 60s than they began looking for places of worship on campuses. There they met other Muslims who shared, immigrant Muslims as well, who shared their interests, including some who came from South Asia and had affiliation with the Pakistani Jama'ati Islamic. Together they created the Muslim Student Association, MSA, starting in a meeting at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign in 1963. Out of this grew the Islamic Society of North America, which in my view now is the premier American Islamic movement in the United States, that has had some overlapping history with Jama'ati Islami and the Muslim Brotherhood students, who later then split from ISNA and decided to pursue action on their own. And of course, with that, the International Institute of Islamic Thought, with their premier scholar Taha Jabir al-Alwani, who developed this concept of fiqh al-aqaliyat, minority jurisprudence. Now, all these groups splitting from, or some of their leaders splitting from the Muslim Brotherhood, which at the time was still an underground culture and underground movement, primarily because dominated by foreign students who many of them returned back home in countries where the Muslim Brotherhood was not allowed to operate in the open, was not legal. So, the rise of groups splitting from the Muslim Brotherhood and forming successful national and international organizations caused the Muslim Brotherhood leaders to feel somewhat marginalized. By the late 80s, the Muslim Brotherhood became cognizant of the fact that many of their members have acquired citizenship and settled in America after receiving jobs, and they decided to pursue a policy of alaniya. Alaniya means going public as opposed to secretive organization. Seems like I still have to. Okay. So what they decide, when they decided to go public, they even changed their name. They didn't call themselves Muslim Brotherhood, although there would have nothing been illegal about it. But they adopted the name Muslim American Society. And they changed, they expressed their mission in ways that did not address the ideology that they brought with them, or the ideology they grew up with in their countries of origin. MAS remained silent on key goals of the International Muslim Brotherhood. The goals they adopted: proclamation of unifying Muslims, stress Islamic values to relate to their non-Muslim surrounding. They outlined perception of common ground values, promoting participation of Muslims in building virtuous moral society, human values that Islam, on the basis of human values that Islam emphasizes: brotherhood, equality, justice, mercy, compassion, and peace. But they remained silent on two goals: establishing an Islamic state and liberating the Islamic nation from non-Muslim occupation. Also, MAS, Muslim American Society, remained silent on the traditional Muslim Brotherhood categorizing of the world into Muslim majority lands and others where Muslims are in the minority. And under that conception, the vision that was officiated in 1994 by the International Organization of Muslim Brothers envisioned the participation of Muslim majorities and minorities under the concept of Ummah that seeks international cooperation in the building of human civilization on the basis of balancing spiritual and material needs. MAS would have been a lot more honest with other Muslims and the American public at large had they addressed those important goals and visions of the Muslim Brotherhood. Question: why insist on Muslim solidarity in an age of pluralism and global interactions? American minorities invest in their internal solidarity. So as long as they pursued this via legal means, no one would stop them. Sometimes the US government even overlooked the misbehavior of minority group leaders in their attempt to keep their members in line. Muslim Brotherhood leaders can be authoritarian, but American political culture respects the autonomy of non-government organizations. Pluralists would not, as a matter of principle, object to minority solidarity so long as it is pursued without expectation of assistance from the state. Thus far, MAS has pursued survival through adaptation, shedding away the past of underground activism, establishing organizational autonomy, and watering down the expression of their ideology. I have a section on the Palestinian members, but some people are interested. Maybe we can go over these in the Q&A session, just for the benefit of the time. I'm going to skip that. The terrorist attacks of September 11 resulted in a range of effects on Islamic activism. Although the US government began to open up to moderate groups of political Islam overseas, domestic law enforcement agencies looked at the Muslim Brotherhood and other groups with increased suspicion. Organizations and leaders with history of affiliation to overseas groups implicated in violence were now identified as either a threat or potential threat. Now, from the perspective of democratic pluralism, the ultimate test of loyalty lies in the reaction of the Muslim Brotherhood members to US commitment of power in Muslim majority lands. The Muslim Brotherhood here and abroad, actually, exhibited diverse responses. Muslim Brotherhood leaders and groups with historical affiliation to the Muslim Brotherhood gave a conditional support for US military action in Afghanistan. They opposed the Iraq war on grounds that it was illegal under international law, although they have not contemplated the very legitimacy of international conventions on war and peace. But this has left some national Muslim Brotherhood factions free to act on their own, regardless of common wisdom among their fellow members. Some Iraqi Muslim Brotherhood members aligned themselves with the US, just as the Kuwaiti Muslim Brotherhood in America and outside America in Kuwait did during the 1990-1991 Gulf War. After September 11, the Bush administration announced a new policy direction in the Arab-Israeli conflict that called for the establishment of a Palestinian state. This was a huge relief for Palestinian American Muslims, including Palestinian members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Encouraged by change in Washington, some Palestinians within the Council on American Islamic Relations, led by board chairman Omar Ahmed, pushed in favor of increased attention to the cause of their kinfolk. But they neither offered concrete ideas, nor did they even exhibit an understanding of the difference between approaching the question of Palestine as a reflection of ethno-religious passion and addressing a national policy issue from an American Muslim perspective. Thus, the early decision of CARE principles to suppress, well, I go this previously, when CARE was established, mainly by Omar Ahmed and Nihad Awad, both are Palestinian, both came from a history of activism in the Islamic Association for Palestine, which was pro-Hamas, before Hamas was involved in violence and was placed on the terrorist list. They split from it and then they started CARE. They decided, against my recommendation at the time, I wanted them to progress into defining their identity and starting with looking at how, as Palestinians and wanting to be American, can pursue a path of public discussion and activism in the public arena. Instead, they decided to just not do anything about Hamas until a few years later they kind of woke up and they wanted to talk about Palestine and we have to do something about Palestine. So that kind of haunted them back after 9/11 and led to a power struggle at CARE's board that ultimately ended up with Omar Ahmed resigning his post. CARE had already established a policy that whatever we do on as CARE, whatever CARE does on this issue, it has to be done from the perspective of addressing a foreign policy issue. CARE continued to pursue public advocacy on its main focus, which is the status of Muslim civil rights in the United States. CARE critics, however, stepped up their attacks, charging that CARE has a private face that is radical. They cited the past involvement of Nihad Awad in the Islamic Association of Palestine and his past favorable mention of Hamas. Awad's refusal to offer a straightforward answer to this charge is ironic because CARE has a well-established reputation of being a community defender. And some of CARE founders, especially Omar Ahmed, had a history in the Muslim Brotherhood in America. So that's the link. If you just ask him why is he talking about this issue. Critics believe that Awad's sympathies to Hamas could still be intact. A more logical explanation based on my observation and my first-hand knowledge of Nihad and care dynamics is that he represents a case of divided loyalties. He is now the unchallenged leader of CARE National. In CARE's daily operations, he yields to his assimilated American Muslim aides, including his own wife, but in private meetings with political leaders, his Palestinian passions dominate his conversation. His evasiveness on Hamas is very ironic because now Hamas leaders separate themselves from the past rhetoric of the group, even its founding charter. I deal with this in a different paper. Okay, so let me just wrap it up here. MAS, which was an education and social service kind of movement after 9/11, feeling now that the Muslim Brotherhood, especially after members of Congress went to Egypt and insisted to want to meet with members of the Egyptian parliament who belonged to the Muslim Brotherhood, after 9/11 felt that the Muslim Brotherhood became under the good Muslim camp. And so they declared their affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And they even claimed that their sense of American Muslim identity is based on the teachings of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, although they have not explained what that really meant. And that continues to be a major challenge and a major background through which the U.S. law enforcement have dealt with law enforcement actions after 9/11. A good bulk of the groups that have been investigated, shut down, and prosecuted have a history or were part of this network of people who are Muslim Brotherhood or have history in the Muslim Brotherhood movement. And the fact that they're not producing real good answers, they're not showing how they have progressed throughout the years from past affiliation with the Muslim Brotherhood ideology to this American Muslim identity caused this suspicion, and from Tony Smith construction of democratic pluralism and his rules of responsible citizenship, yes, they owe the public an explanation. And if they haven't really reached an explanation, they can attach themselves to people like Tariq Ramadan. I think what Tariq Ramadan is trying to do is to Americanize the Muslim Brotherhood vision. That's what he's doing. Although I can tell you, when I developed the CARE report on the status of Muslim civil rights, I found that, and this has been the legacy of CARE actually, that advocating for Muslim clients by attaching yourself to the Constitution and to equal citizenship rights would be more profitable to Muslims, even looking strategically at the issue, than trying to establish the claim that we are a Muslim minority that is loyal, that is cognizant and aware of the majority in the country in which we are citizen, and we're trying to just act like nice people. Actually, when MAS jumped into the fray of public advocacy, they mimicked CARE's approach. So we can talk about this if you want.
Before opening the floor, I would like to thank the presenters for a very stimulating presentation, focusing on processes, actors, and narrative to examine how Muslims are shaping the public space and are also being shaped by that. So the floor is open. You identify yourself and you comment or ask questions. So I think we have roughly 20 minutes for discussion.
So two quick questions about it. One to Amal about the term political Islam, because as in my understanding, political Islamists are trying to build an Islamic state where they are majority and try to implement Islamic law when they are minority in family issues and others. But when you look at the four groups you examine, the four groups you mentioned, the first one, the youth, very secular rioting. The other one, Islamically inspired, secular and political activism of Tariq Ramazan and others. And the third one, simply fundamentalist Salafi. And the fourth one had some political debate, but hard to define any of the particular four as political Islamists. Therefore, would it be better to use the term Islamic activism rather than political Islam, or Islamic activism with some fundamentalism emphasized rather than using the term political Islam? And to Mohammed, my question is, would it be really fair to define Tariq Ramazan as Americanizing, because he was
Westernizing.
Allowed to get in America, right?
Westernizing.
Yeah. And then one may say that Mohammed Nimar is trying to Tony Smithsonizing Muslims. Well, how would you respond to that?
Sherry Brysock, I'm a journalist. I would like to ask anyone on the panel, there's been some speculation about the difference between a place like Marseille and Paris as to why the riots happened in Paris and Lyon in 2005 and not in Marseille, which has a larger Muslim population than either city. Is it the banlieue problem, or do they have better beaches? Maybe you can address that, please.
My question is addressed basically to everybody, but specifically to Natalie and Amel. It's regarding your findings, your research about how young Muslims are viewed in France. Are your findings just can be extended to those who are French but who originally are from the sub-Saharan Africa, or is just focused on the northern part of Africa?
To answer your question, but actually the response is going to be quite simple. I was going to present a paper on the evolution of political Islam, and I shifted the topic at the last minute. So that's why the title was not reflecting what I discussed in my paper. But I didn't mention political Islam in my presentation, and I talked about Islamic activism indeed. Nonetheless, to answer your question, that's the exact challenge of explaining what political Islam is now, currently in Europe or in the West at large. Because this is a problem of an uprooted culture that took place first and foremost in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, and then has been transplanted in Europe and in France in particular. And my quick explanation or my quick analysis related to this work on political Islam is that political Islam and mainly the Muslim Brotherhood kind of inspired kind of political Islam have been transmitted through mechanisms that Nathalie has described actually. You know, this importance of shifting the social domination, giving confidence to young French Muslims and so on. But that was in the 80s and till the middle of the 90s. And then young French Muslims have readapted and reinvented these codes, these political Islam codes, in something else. And Islam is still, for Islamic activists currently in Europe, the first reference or the first resource for the definition of their identity, of their political claims, but in a total different connection with the state, for example, or with the look at the West as the enemy. I mean, all these assumptions and all these narratives have changed a lot. I would let Nathalie answer the question on Marseille and Paris and the differences between the two cities. And for your question on the variant differences between the North African community and the sub-Saharan world, I would say that it may be relevant for the immigrant generation. But for the second one, or young Muslim girls born in France, being from having either a North African or sub-Saharan background, I would say that the way they adopt the veil is much more linked to the way they perceive their. Okay, there are two main features. First, the generational one. The way Maghrebi or Sub-Saharan African girls were wearing the veil in the 90s is not the same way they are wearing it now in the 2010. Why? Because in the 90s it was really seen as a courageous sign, as a sign that was challenging the main culture and the main public culture. It was seen as a controversial decision, both among the parents of these girls and among and in the public sphere. But with the massification, really, of the sense of the veil, I mean, you cannot have this explanation anymore. And you have a lot of girls now who are wearing the veil without being connected at all to any kind of political demands based on Islam. So you have the generational factor, and you have also the kind of religiosities or the kind of political ideologies they are opposed to. So to answer your question, for people who are recognizing themselves, to sum up, in the Tarek Ramadan's kind of discourses, the veil is tried to be not to be an obstacle to their social and political integration, while girls that are wearing a kind of Salafi veil is much more seen as a sign of social distinction and identification as a specific religious group. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, on the same question, Muhammad Timera will be presenting the last session of this afternoon dealing with exactly the issue.
Well, to answer your question very, very straightforwardly, the answer is yes. I think Tony Smith offers a very useful framework that can help us analyze U.S. foreign policy action and domestic policy, and also understand the place of the Muslim Brotherhood, and you can apply it to other groups as well. And actually, after reading Tony Smith, I look back at what I have done at CARE since I joined them in 1996, and I was applying a pluralist model in the way I constructed research projects at the Council on American Islamic Relations. So the answer is yes, absolutely.
Natalie, on Marseille.
Short answer about Marseille and Paris. Some scholars studied urban riots in 2005 in the Paris area, and they showed that riots started from areas where we find a very strong ethnic segregation. And the place where riots started was in Clichy-sous-Bois. In Clichy-sous-Bois, there is an area there, Clichy-sous-Bois is a quite terrible city, high level of unemployment, but also an area where we find the most important level of ethnic segregation in France. 70% of an area is comprised of population of minority background. So the case of Clichy-sous-Bois is especially interesting, but there is not only the case of Clichy-sous-Bois, there is also Montfermeil, different disadvantaged neighborhood around Paris. So I think the characteristic of ethnic segregation combined with high level of unemployment, failure at school are definitely very important. In Marseille, the case of Marseille is really interesting because there were no riots, whereas there were riots in France, in many cities. Not only in Paris, also Strasbourg, Lyon, Lille, etc., and so on. And Marseille has a multi-ethnic identity for a very long time. And many young people in Marseille of North African background, they feel coming from Marseille. We are Marseillais. There is a strong sense of belonging, whereas it's much less the case in France. There is also a strong sense of belonging, but also very strong association created by militants, and they do a fantastic work to establish a permanent dialogue with young people, between local authorities and young people. But the fact that there were no riots in Marseille does not mean that it's working very well there. There were many problems in Marseille, many problems. But it's true that this strong sense of belonging and a very tight, yes, social networks prevented riots, yes. You have to say that in France, contrary to England, for example, you go to England, you ask the question to Asian people, young Asian people. Many of them say, we feel British. When I went there, I was so surprised. Where do you come from? I am British. Most of the time there is no problem about this. Whereas in France, it's much more complicated. Many people, if you ask North African, young people of North African background, they don't say, we feel French. They feel different. There is a wide panel of, a wide diversity of belongings, but saying, I feel French, it's not easy to hear this in France.
I'm going to take the last round of questions.
My name is Bettina. I'm a graduate of Wesleyan University of International Relations. I am American, and I would like to know if you guys have thought about the challenge of integration in context of the history of Muslims in America going back to before Columbus. Ivan Van Sertima is one scholar. Sylvia Juf is another one. I would like to mention Peter Salem, who was one of the first American revolutionaries who was a martyr. His last name was Salam, actually. He was a Muslim. So I think the history of Islam in America should be examined as to help create tolerance for Islam in America. I put a newsletter outside because I have my own perspective and my own history I would like to share. Thank you.
If you want to comment on the comment, it's fine.
Well, let me say something quickly. This history of Islam has been appropriated by Muslim activists, by convert Muslims especially, who wants to retrieve that history to legitimize Muslim membership in American society. So it's an ongoing process. A recent example is the documentary movie called The Prince Among Slaves, which was a
last.
Thank you. What this young woman just said, I think it's very interesting, and I think that the thing that would aid Muslims the most in the United States is if they were to come out, like she said, that she's an American first, and that be said all over the Muslim world as to be pro-American as opposed to anti-American. I think anyone doing that would make a major change in the society. Thank you.
I'm Muslim first. I'm sorry. My relationship with God comes first.
Okay, well, that may be, but okay, I'm not going to explain.
I thought that's what we were trying to do here.
And we are are not going to open a comment. Thank you very much.